Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. In this, our first episode for 2020, we'll take stock of a tumultuous summer of bushfires and climate wars, battles over Australia Day, and now coronavirus, our latest mass hysterical event, which not even a one-party state can control. That's China I'm talking about, not Australia. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a product of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au to find out how you can support this wonderful organisation, our research and this podcast. And as always, we'll close with our books and culture segment. Today we're talking about a new book on whether our cities can cope with rising populations, an old classic by the late, great Sir Roger Scruton, a former guest of the IPA, the Brad Pitt movie Ad Astra, and also the contemporary novel of a marriage breakdown and something or other called Fleishman is in Trouble, one of those great New York books that Chris Berg will talk about. That was Fleishman, not Flashman, for fans of George MacDonald Fraser. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Time now to introduce our panellists. First up, my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott, and happy January to you.
Happy January, happy 2020. Happy belated Australia Day, yep. Dr. Bella de Brera.
Yes, thank you. A few days ago, but we're still basking in its glory.
Yeah, that's right, we are. Go Australia. We love Australia. And, of course, Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
Great to have you back on the show. Yes, Australia Day, Chris.
That's right. So attentive listeners will know that Australia Day was once again held on the 26th of January this year against the wishes of a fairly large Australia Day protest march, marching under the banner of the Pay the Rent. There were tens of thousands of people in definitely Melbourne and Sydney and other major capital cities. Pay the Rent, for those who don't know, is actually an argument for a form of reparations. In fact, they're specifically calling for a land tax scheme on people who own property, Australians who own property would then pay rent to the traditional owners of the land. Australia Day seems to be getting more and more prominently divisive. I'm not sure whether it's divisive in the general population, but that's the research that you've been doing, Bella. So why don't you take us through how Australians think outside the tens of thousands marching in the streets?
I think they think like Ash Barty, who was asked on court, actually in the press conference afterwards, what she thought about the protest, and she said, to be honest, I didn't even know it was happening.
Thank you, Ash.
So I think she represents what we find every year in the polls, which is the vast majority are proud to be Australian and they love Australia Day. 71% this year, 75% last year, 71% the year before that, and I think 70% the year before that. So it stays in the majority consistently every year. But I think you're right. There is that the minority have to sort of take their argument to an extreme every year. So this year it was sort of demanding the reparations. They didn't do that. They didn't pull that stunt last year. The polls reflect what most Australians believe about Australia and how they think about themselves.
Andrew, how should we think about this apparent disconnect, increasingly loud voice for change the date or pay the rent or what have you?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right that it's kind of seems to have accelerated somewhat.
Certainly in the last couple of years.
And I think with this pay the rent idea now being attached to it, it's not going to be enough. It's not enough just to say that the 26th of January is the right day to have Australia Day simply because it is the day that we currently have it. So it's not defending the status quo as the status quo. There should be an attempt to affirm why 26th of Australia is a good day to have it, beyond the fact that it's extremely convenient to have a public holiday at that time of the year, which again is not necessarily going to be an argument that will persuade this growing minority of people who feel alienated from the day. I think the best way of thinking about it, and I have put some thought into this. I haven't simply dismissed the protests out of hand, because I do think that the purpose of national holidays really is supposed to be unifying. And if some people are saying we really cannot get over this to join in the celebration, I think that's worth paying attention to. But I think the framing of it as Invasion Day, which has been sort of the thing that's driven this, is obviously a tendentious framing, but it also ignores the fact that 26th of January is for better or worse, it is the day that the people who make up the Commonwealth of Australia, which is the thing that we're celebrating, came together on the island. That is the historical reality, and the truth is that moving forward as a country together, that will always be the moment where that became a necessity, right, for us to start sharing institutions and to find a way to live together.
I reckon there's sort of two tensions here that that we haven't quite solved. There's some people who think that January 26 is the day that just needs to be changed. So let's say we put it on January the 27th or May 8, Mate Day, as some people have argued, slightly tongue-in-cheek. But, let's say you move it to another general day, and then that would deal with people who have specific objections to that specific date. But to your point, the fundamental critique of January the 26th strikes me as quite wrong, because what happened on January 26th did not inevitably mean the bad things that might have happened to Indigenous people afterwards. And in fact, I've got in front of me an account of the First Fleet landing. So precisely what happened on January 26th? Well, they debarked at Sydney Cove in Port Jackson, New South Wales, and I'm going to quote from Arthur Phillip's account, "In the evening of the 26th, the colours were displayed on shore, and the governor, with several of his principal officers and others, assembled around the flag, drank to the king's health and success of the settlement."
Hurrah!
There was no violence there. There was no obvious interaction with the Indigenous population. Maybe it happened and we don't know about it, but certainly on January 26th, it was a peaceful landing and a peaceful settlement.
With the greatest of respect to yourself and Mr. Bushnell, I don't think you actually heard what Bella said. I think you're way overthinking this. As Ash Barty said, as Bella said, the vast majority of Australians are not passing Australia Day, analysing it in these senses. Status quo, maybe it's under-theorised, but it's not a bad place to start for most people. And I don't think there's a large and growing movement. The polls that Bella's been commissioning for the Institute of Public Affairs over the past couple of years, if anything, shows a solidifying of support for just leaving things the way they are and continuing to celebrate the nation. And ironically, what's underneath all this, we're actually reaching an accommodation, whether they want to admit it or not. If you change the date away from Australia Day, then there's no particular reason to acknowledge the heritage of the Indigenous peoples and both the good things and the bad things that flowed from the colonisation of this country. It actually has created a platform for people to put the focus on, call it dispossession, colonisation, whatever. If it was some other date, that wouldn't be relevant. So we're now actually almost in this yin and yang situation where those protests are just as much part of the tradition of Australia Day as the citizenship.
Perhaps growing is the wrong word, but like intensification.
Well,
perhaps.
That's what I was saying. I mean, every year they'd have to do something a little bit more extreme than they did last year. They didn't have this pay the rent last year because
I think what Scott gets at there is right. That if you change the date, then I would give it a negative frame. I'd say if you change the date, then the debates won't go away, because the argument will still be, well, how can we celebrate Australia on whatever date? Right. So I don't think that simply changing the date again will be a solution to the underlying problem. And again, that's why I think that perhaps even though most people don't engage in this at all, but I think that notwithstanding, I think there is room to tell a positive story about January 26th that perhaps hasn't really been made. And I think if it can be made, then I think that is the only thing that is going to, over the long term, start to assuage people, is if people can come to see the day as representing something different from how at least some people currently see it.
But Scott, you haven't actually addressed the main challenge which Andrew raised just before, which is, okay, so there is, let's say there's 30% of people and 70% of people. 30% of people oppose Australia Day.
No, it's not 30%. It's 11%.
Okay, 11%.
You've got the ones in the middle who don't care, we're not going to be out in the streets protesting.
Exactly.
But even if it's 11%, 10% of people a tenth of Australia has some really serious issues with precisely what Andrew has described as a day that's meant to demonstrate unity. Is that a problem?
No, because, there's 10% of people are going to be opposed to everything, and God bless them, this is a democracy. But it's like, we might get to Tanya Plibersek talking about the pledge. As possibly the only member of the panel old enough to remember when we still used to pledge allegiance to the Queen in our primary school yards as the Australian flag was raised, there used to be a tremendous upset around that. Fancy declaring allegiance to this foreign monarch and referencing God. And isn't that a terrible thing? So that was a huge argument. And then, Keating, of course, changed the pledge. And the Queen doesn't get a Guernsey anymore. So there's always this level of disaffection, and I'm in terms of invented traditions, and we are inventing a tradition. The Hawke government was the first to really get around Australia Day, and I know it can be critiqued. Eric Hobsbawm famously edited a volume of work on invented traditions. Hugh Trevor Roper, Lord Dacre talked about the kilts of Scotland. It's all made up. Well, I don't care if it's made up. It's our national story. And if we have to double down on it and enrich that story even more so that it does have even more appeal, I'm all for it. And I think we're actually enriching it with the stories of in what it meant for the Indigenous Australians. That can be just as much part of the narrative as everything else.
And I think, but there's also the question that we asked about, are you proud to be Australian, which is related to Australia Day, and 85% say they are proud to be Australian. Only 5% said they weren't. So it doesn't. So I still think that there is not this massive disaffection and hatred of Australia and unhappy people walking around on Australia Day that
you would get from the media.
You would get from the media. I really don't think there is.
So, Scott, you raised Tanya Plibersek, so we should talk about that. So Tanya Plibersek gave and she's the Shadow Education, I think, gave a speech on patriotism to the citizenship ceremony that she hosted at the Sydney Opera House, because she's the member of Sydney, and if you're the member of Sydney, you get to speak at the Sydney Opera House when you do the sort of bog standard MP duties, where she reflected on the citizenship pledge. The citizenship pledge, and feel free to join in chorus as I read this out to you, everyone. It says, "From this time forward, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey." Of course, if you receive citizenship in a formal ceremony, you have to give that citizenship pledge. Tanya Plibersek's argument is that every Australian school student should learn this and think carefully about what it means. She went on to discuss the nature of patriotism and so on. Now, this has been described widely as everybody should be saying the pledge at school, which is not quite, I think, what she says, as someone who was raised in the United States and stood awkwardly as the Australian child in the back as everybody pledged allegiance to the flag. And I stood up, but I didn't pledge because that would have been weird. But anyway, so apart from that little personal anecdote, Bella, should every Australian student learn that? Is this a debate we finally need to have?
Well, I didn't.
Or do we already love Australia too much?
So I think there's the first thing that there's two pledges. Then one mentions God, and she obviously hasn't put that one in because people's heads would have exploded in the audience.
Because it's optional.
Yeah, there's an option. There's the first option is mentioning God, and the other one isn't. So I think it's a great idea, but the children don't know what they're going to be pledging allegiance to because they're not taught anything. So I think it's a wonderful idea, but maybe give them the background first about what they're actually pledging allegiance to. It's going to be empty words for them, because they're not taught about what their rights, they won't even know what rights they're talking about.
That's a brilliant point, Bella, because kids have that annoying habit of saying why.
Yeah, well, why am I saying this? What am I talking about? Yeah. But they're not ever going. They're not going to tell.
They can show a map.
Well, and that's the problem. That's the problem with all of this, is that it makes it
picture of Canberra and Scott Morrison.
It makes it all really self-conscious. Whereas if a country is really strong and confident in itself, then these beliefs are held by people without some sort of self-conscious reminder of them all the time.
But if they were taught at school, naturally, This is what it is. These are the
and
values.
they would come to love their country.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing. Although on the other hand,
But I mean, Tanya agrees with you here. So go.
Yeah, no. Well, I tend to agree with what Tanya Plibersek said, at least on Twitter. But I think that when I was a kid, every Monday we stood at attention and we saluted the flag and sang the national anthem, and it did me a world of good. I think it's
now you know
I think it's a really good idea. I think it's a really good idea.
I think that was once a week, and the point really about doing something like that is to be grateful and to feel as though you are connected to the country that is giving you so much, and that you have a responsibility for it. And I think when Tanya Plibersek said that Australia Day should be about what we have in common and about solidarity, I think she's absolutely right. The question is, whether it necessarily comes loaded with a whole bunch of, politically contested terms like Australia's democratic rights. Well, okay, what exactly
was
does
only
we talking about?
politically contested
Equality, what kind of equality are we talking about?
In her speech, it's about what we owe each other as citizens. Patriotism, like mateship, is about solidarity.
It was a terrific speech.
They can't.
Good on her.
I think she did the right thing.
She was right.
The reaction from the left is
the reaction from the left is fantastic because it's exactly what you'd expect. First of all, she mentions patriotism, which is probably the worst thing that she could be mentioning.
Yep.
Because these people are the good hearts. They're the anywheres.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And they also, and I think they hate the fact that she's talking about schools because they believe that they have one in the schools. They don't like the fact that someone's actually suggesting something else because they own the schools, they own education.
Yeah. And the furor against her that came from the left is exactly why the centre left is dying. They can't win anywhere in the English-speaking world, and it's precisely because even a mainstream figure from the left of the centre-left party, Tanya Plibersek, can't say, I am proud of my country and I think we should raise our children to be proud of it too. And the idea that this is somehow offensive when these kids are going to grow up to be the stewards of this very country and its traditions, the idea that they shouldn't feel grateful for receiving them, the idea that they shouldn't feel connected to them and some ownership and responsibility for them is baffling to me, and I'm sure it was baffling to Tanya, who probably didn't think that she had said anything particularly controversial.
I think she knows what she's doing. I think she knows what she's doing.
This has happened before.
This is a very anodyne speech.
I would have been surprised.
This is a very anodyne speech, and there is not really anything to object to with it at all. And I'm 100% right. But what my concern that should be raised is, again, precisely to your point, that the love of nation, love of country people should come organically. It's not a dictate from the shadow education minister, and I don't want to hear it from the Prime Minister. I don't want to hear these sorts of things. I actually want us to have an organic love of each other or solidarity with each other, not just a state-driven. And when I'm like, well, we should get the schools to do this, because that's the power you have. We give you the children for 15 years and we let you play with them. This strikes me as just another way to, pledge loyalty, not as much to other people, but to the state as well.
But children aren't going to be organically loving their country. You're not born loving Australia you grow to love Australia because in assembly you see the flag and you see everyone else and you sing the national anthem and you're told about Australian values. You have to. So I think this is good. I think the Prime Minister should be talking about it, and I think she should be talking about it. I disagree with you. I think you're not just born patriotic. You have to be told about
I think the organic part of
it
is like I think it was Berg who said for people to love their country should be lovely. And that's the organic part of it, is that if you actually have a good country and you actually pay attention to why it's good, then you will come to love it. But there's no reason why we shouldn't have a school system that in some way, I'm not necessarily saying that this pledge is the exact right wording or even that a pledge is the exact, I think singing the national anthem was fine as well, but the idea that we shouldn't have a school system that reinforces that in some way. It would actually be very nice for the school system to do something that reinforces what
something
kids
positive.
Get from home, rather than constantly being at war with parents, which is how it's set up now.
And something positive to offset all the negative stuff that's going on in the school.
Absolutely. Well, of course, one of the reasons why the schools can't do this is they're spending all of their time teaching the children about climate change, getting the kids to watch videos of David Attenborough dying polar bears, Al Gore, climate catastrophe or whatever. And that's sort of an extended lead into talking about what really has been the great conversation of the summer, which is we have had a terrible bushfire season. There's no doubt about that. Over 18 million hectares of land has been burnt, nearly 3,000 homes, and 34 people tragically have lost their lives. And it's been awful. Australia has had similar seasons before, as we'll discuss, but it's worth focusing on the social phenomenon of seeing how the reaction to that was dominated by these discussions of climate change.
No, it was a remarkable summer in that sense, and as you say, it was a genuinely even shocking fire season just for the sheer scale of the fires. And as you say, fires are a part of the Australian experience and part of the Australian environment, but this was a very, very bad one by any measure. It's been caused, the proximate cause, of course, is the combination of a drought since about 2007 and quite a hot start to the summer. The fires have, or the danger has eased over the last couple of weeks, but certainly over Christmas, it really shaped Australian politics. And it really shaped the way Australians thought about, I suspect it actually changed how we thought about climate change and the climate change debate. But I think that's worth discussing. So obviously there was a lot of criticism of Scott Morrison and leadership and so forth, and I think we should skip over that because it's no longer as interesting as it was a couple of weeks ago. But why don't I throw to you first, Andrew? Do you think this changes the climate change debate? Not should it change the climate change debate, but do you think it has?
I think it has somewhat. I think that the government was rocked onto its heels a little bit by how vociferous the response was and how, frankly, organised the campaign was to link the bushfire season to climate change and to the Liberals' sort of 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out climate change policy, which is what they've always had because their internal politics means that they're constantly trying to assuage two different constituencies
with precisely the opposite view.
Yeah, so, and there's really no, they're half pregnant on the issue, and there's really no other way for them at the moment. But I think that the government sort of had to scramble a little bit in its political response. I mean, obviously, they weren't thinking that this was how it was going to play, given that they had ministers on holidays overseas and things like that. If it had occurred to them that any fire was going to be linked to climate change, then I think they would have been better prepared. So yes, I think it has forced the Liberal Party to at least play this game in the media that it always plays about trying to assure its, let's face it, its inner city wealthy electorates that it cares about the issue. And we might see something concrete come out of that, or we might not, depending on whether Scott Morrison can finesse the issue away or not.
Yeah, it was as you say, it was a very organised response. There's no doubt, and I don't think this is a conspiracy theory to say that this is exactly what many of these organisations had prepared for. We've seen a degree of strategising which is sort of impressive if you just take the politics out of it, which is, as global warming became climate change and then it became a debate about extreme weather events and a narrative that there's more extreme weather events despite the paucity of evidence to that. And of course, one of the things that I found remarkable, so that's the activists pushing the line that this is because of climate change. It was a little bit sad to see across the social media channels this idea that not only should Scott Morrison be doing something about this, but that he could do something about it straight away. So many times I actually saw that if Australia had have reduced its emissions, we wouldn't have had these bushfires. This idea that, say going back to a point 20 years ago, if we'd done something different, then it would have approximately affected the temperature of the globe in Australia right at the moment. The level
I think that speaks to a kind of an almost new, or at least rediscovered ruthlessness in this campaign, that they were willing to use that line, because everyone knows that however you feel, or whatever you know about the science, or however you feel about the political response to it, Everyone knows that if Australia had reduced its emissions to zero 15 years ago, we would still have bushfires.
But
Everyone knows that. And their ruthlessness about using that line is actually...
Yeah, and they accuse the deniers of ignoring science.
There is a criticism here. So there is a criticism of not just this government, but the previous government and the government before that, about the failure, because of the overriding focus on climate change mitigation. So let's cut emissions to zero or not. And so we debate that never-endingly. But we don't focus on the thing that we need to focus on, which is adaptation policies. And it has bugged me for the better part of 2 decades that we get report after report focusing on things like, well, how are we going to adapt to changing climates, whether it's anthropogenic or whether it's just the natural climate change, and
we're coming out of an ice age,
or whatever it is. But we don't focus on dealing with emergency management. We don't focus on those basic adaptation problems. So there is a failure it's a failure of political leadership here, because we are not making our country as robust to natural disasters that are happening, whether more frequently or less frequently, but with a significantly greater cost because of rising population, more capital investment, better houses. It just gets, these natural disasters end up getting worse for us over time as we get richer and more populous, and we need to focus on adapting to it. There's the Productivity Commission put out a report on this in 2013, and it never made a sound because no one cared. Everyone wanted to debate carbon taxes, but we need to be thinking about emergency management. We need to be thinking about adaptation.
And no, it's a good point. But I don't only blame the politicians. I mean, I look at the political economy. So first of all, you get this reactive BS where everyone's focused on fighting fires, and so suddenly you throw money at the state fire services to have another tanker and another aeroplane and another helicopter, and of course it wouldn't matter how much water they were dropping on a wildfire, it would make absolutely no difference whatsoever. But it's a highly visible, expensive things you can do. But I contest the idea that it's purely a failure of leadership, because in the context of bushfires, they are blocked from the adaptation. So let's assume a warming globe probably is warming a bit. Let's assume that increases the background risk of bushfires. Would that not be a very good argument for preventative burns, reducing the fuel load, fire breaks, access trails, not locking up land in more and more national and state parks and then forgetting about it? All of the allowing people to clear around their houses without having to go through the hoops of native vegetation permits from local councils. Adaptation would actually mean a whole bunch of things that the same green idiots, I know this is looking forward, but anyway, sometimes I can't help it. The same green idiots who run that ruthless line about this all being about climate change are the same people that won't let you actually do anything to reduce not the incidents but the outcome, the negative outcomes, the catastrophic outcomes of those bushfires.
I feel like we've lost knowledge that we used to do this and we stopped doing it, and this is what happens. And it's not. It doesn't seem to be very complicated. Land management, isn't it? Just knowing that this is going to happen every season and mitigating against it.
And every year that knowledge goes out of the system.
Yeah, and it seems like we've lost knowledge. So it's sort of retrograde.
I mean, when forests were managed as an economic resource, the same people who managed those forests were also the same ones who over the summer used to take responsibility for fire management. Over the winter, they take responsibility for preventative measures. Of course, Indigenous knowledge has been pushed aside, as we've just talked about Bill Gamage's work on how Aboriginal people manage fire. So it's traditional knowledge of all kinds have been pushed out of the system.
But understanding that the role that we have as a society is to manage the environment in which we are. So that is to mitigate against risks, to adapt to known challenges, and to just manage our way through this is actually a major change, because so many people in this debate are driven by a vision of what we ought to be doing, or a sort of utopian vision of the world as it could be or should be, rather than, okay, well, we have this is the reality that we have. Some of us live in the bush, some of us we live in a incredibly fire-prone country. How do we deal with those facts on the ground? And that's just not the way the environmental debate has happened for the last 2 decades.
I think what's happened is that it's this idea that this idea that human beings are sort of pestilential and we're the pestilence on the earth, and the trees and the grass are the goodies and we're the baddies, so we should let them be.
There's a kind of tension in that, that kind of materialist idea that they have of humans as animals, is that they want us to, on one hand, accept that we can engineer the entire climate, but they want us to ignore the things that we can engineer more concretely, directly. And they parody that as saying that we want to, pave the forests so they can't catch on fire. But if you take this seriously, that we are beings capable of manipulating our environment to our advantage, then you really ought to start locally, right? That the environment that is most easily managed is the one that you yourself live in. And so I think there's a real tension there in their thought that hasn't perhaps been taken up. I'm not sure how you turn it into a political message, but it's they want you to accept that at the macro level, engineering is possible, but to ignore what you can do at the micro level. And it seems to me that it's actually much more likely to be the other way around, that it's much easier to manipulate your environment at the micro level.
It might not even be easier, just more likely to
actually work.
Yes, actually happen.
And that's always been the issue. So on climate change mitigation, regardless of, so let's say you accept all the science, or just say you accept the IPCC's recommendations and predictions and so forth. Scott's getting a phone call as we speak. If you accept all the IPCC's predictions, regardless, it's just not clear that the world is going to come together and develop a global climate treaty that materially affects this. So we have to focus on adaptation.
This is the thing. Again, that the left with its rationalist streak, you would have thought would have taken up this problem as a game theoretical. It's basically a prisoner's dilemma. That if Australia goes first, we stand to lose. We stand to gain if you accepting everything that the IPC says, that we only stand to gain if everyone opts in. But a truly rational actor will try and be the free rider on the system. And that's assuming, right, that all of the parties in the game are equal partners. But of course they're not. There are 5 actors in the global system, more or less, 5 or 6, who really determine global emission levels. And if they don't play the game...
And one of them's Australia, right? Or am I... or I'm not...
New Zealand?
Yeah, exactly. And if one of, the United States, the European Union, China, Russia, Brazil doesn't play this game, then the game is moot. And this is not... this is the left responds to this argument as that's an excuse for doing nothing. Excuse is a loaded word. It's a reason for doing nothing, right? It's completely rational for Australia to look at what other actors in the game.
I would just say it's an explanation of the fundamental problem. You look at the world as it is, and you identify that it's very unlikely that you're going to come to global political agreement on an issue like this. So then what? And it's that accepting the fundamental reality, and maybe you can challenge that argument. But if you accept that fundamental reality, then you have to think, then what? And it's adaptation.
Come back to adaptation. And incidentally, the other part of the narrative was that this is an unprecedented bushfire season. I mean, that is just complete rubbish. I mean, so 18 million hectares, which is a lot. There's no doubt about it. But, in 74-5, there was over 100 million hectares in Australia affected by fire. I mean, what part of the political economy this was? It started in Sydney. The smoke haze over Sydney. Our media is run out of Sydney, and that's when the political intensity really started to increase.
And around Canberra, of course.
Yeah, and then it migrated to Canberra. So if it had been, we had bushfires in Victoria, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, where it was maybe a bit long, where the ones that were in the Central Highlands, essentially, away from the major population centre. I'm not talking about Black Saturday. They just don't get the coverage. Yep. They don't. If it doesn't have the footage, then it's just not real. It's not happening. Yeah. So
you could argue also, I think, at a more theoretical level, that the sort of future bias of progressivism entails forgetting the past. even its deliberate erasure. And taken to its extreme, with the concept of like year zero or something like that. But there's a reason for doing it, and that is because all eyes need to be focused on the future. And so it might just be that some of the people driving this particular response are just constitutionally incapable of remembering things.
Yep. And have no interest in doing so. One of the other events that's a bit more recent that's been driving media headlines and perhaps has led to the same kind of mass hysteria is coronavirus.
Speaking of crisis,
I don't think it's hysteria, Scott. I think we're all going to.
Okay, let's get the facts. We'll talk the facts and then we'll throw it over.
Leading with my view. I'm just getting my view.
You haven't started building a bunker yet.
Facts first.
I've started building a hospital.
My job is to do facts and then we argue, right?
Yep.
Okay. So the latest numbers of the coronavirus out of China is that there's about 4,500 people infected with the virus, and there's 106 people dead. Of course, as we all know, the center of the epidemic is in the city of Wuhan, which is in the Hubei province. Wuhan, along with probably with about a dozen other cities, have been locked down now as part of the Chinese state's attempt to manage the virus. There's actually quite a lot to talk about here, because why this is interesting is a totalitarian state meets a public health epidemic and struggles, or succeeds, depending on your perspective. But why don't we ask Andrew what your view is on certainly how the Chinese state has responded, or what's the bigger picture that we should be thinking about?
Well, it seems like the Chinese Communist Party, as it always does, has responded just with brute strength. Right, so it's just deployed a lot of resources as quickly as it can. They're throwing up
once it admitted it happened.
And this is the thing, that their first priority is to control the information. Actually, for fans of the show Chernobyl, is that the response is actually quite similar, in that the first thing is, well, let's control that as a PR problem. Then it's brute force. So they've deployed enough people to build a hospital in 6 days. We saw this with the SARS virus a few years ago as well. So the same response. They've literally blockaded the roads in and out of affected areas. So it's going to be, it's not especially like a scientific tailored response. It's a brute force response, at least for
the Chernobyl. I'll let you continue a sec, but the Chernobyl parallel is really interesting, because the Chinese internet censors are now blocking discussions about Chernobyl, because on things like the IMDb page of Chernobyl, people were having all these really intense discussions about how all these Chinese people are having really suddenly intense discussions about how well the Russian state dealt with the Chernobyl disaster, obviously talking about China's response.
Yeah, and I think that it's very hard to get a handle on anything that actually happens in China, and so we don't know how well they're doing. There are reports that this virus is much more virulent than other outbreaks we've seen recently. But you don't know how reliable that is, because it's based on reporting. There might be as many deaths already from this as there were in the entire SARS outbreak a few years ago, which means that it's happening much more quickly. But again, it's really hard to know exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is doing about this, which means, of course, it's time to panic.
But that's what we're saying. I mean, so some private schools in Australia have just said that any student who's been in China over the summer break is not allowed to come to school for the first 2 weeks. And given the astronomical fees that their parents are paying, that must be hell for them. That does strike me as a sign of panic. And Chris, before you were saying, what's going to happen with Australian universities and the tens of thousands Chinese students?
That's right. So again, we just don't have enough good information. But 4,500 people with 106 deaths. That's not a remarkably high casualty rate, if you will. given that thousands of Australians die from the flu every year and tens of thousands of people in the United States, and we don't have good data out of China again. But to your point, you can never trust the data that comes out of these sorts of places for a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and deliberate political misleading. And you know, Andrew, you raised these big publicity moves like we're going to build a hospital in 6 days, although now they're talking about doing it in 2 weeks. And in fact, the state media was already showing pictures of this hospital, which turns out had been copied off a real estate ad. There's a lot, and then just doing a little bit.
They don't care about getting caught. Like
doing
that.
a little
really
bit.
don't care.
No, of course they don't. But doing a little bit of research around, turns out building a hospital in a medical disaster in that space of time is actually not that rare, and NGOs in the Ebola crisis were able to build a similar hospital
like a
in
MASH.
about 3 weeks, which
It's
is
gonna be a MASH.
slightly slower, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I know. It's because when they say we're building a hospital, everyone imagines something like the Alfred Hospital
No,
or
it's
something
gonna
like
be-
a huge
it's
brick
gonna
You mean
building.
tents.
Yeah,
That's
about
right.
No,
MASH,
chuck
the MASH
you
outfit.
out big tents. Yeah.
The MASH outfit.
But what is hugely problematic is just the way politics in a country like China intervenes on every aspect of the management of a disaster or crisis like this. So, for example, one of the more horrifying things is that Taiwan has been excluded from World Health Organization meetings about the coronavirus because, of course, China doesn't recognize Taiwan. And if China decides to take revenge on the World Health Organization, then, well, that's the end of the World Health Organization. So the idea that you could have the protection of political ideologies at the expense of disaster management, I think that's the scary and the interesting
But
part about this.
that's long-term rationality, though, from the actors within the Communist Party that controls China, is that
under the assumption that they themselves don't die, they still want to be in charge afterwards.
Exactly.
Of course,
so
yeah.
the regime doesn't live or die based on, well, unless this really does turn out to be as virulent as claimed, but the regime doesn't live or die based on its response. It lives or dies on a much longer time scale. Yeah. But on that point about the WHO, I mean, and about how we don't know what China is doing, and about how China's actions, as again, for people interested in climate change as well, we don't know really how their actions affect us. And there's a kind of, it's another symbol of how naive the Western world has been in its engagement with China, in thinking that the international institutions that were set up largely by the United States are robust enough to deal with an authoritarian, very large, very powerful country that does not always act, to put it lightly, in good faith. And so, again, the Chinese response to this is worth watching, because it's a signal of how trustworthy we think they are, given that we have intermingled our relations over the last 20 years to such an extent.
Yeah, and the challenge is, how do you run a World Health Organization when one of your biggest members is a bad actor on the world stage? And no, I think that's a hugely significant point.
It is, and we might come back to this in future weeks where we'll...
Well, hopefully not, though, to be honest.
Well, if nothing much happens over the next few weeks, I will make a point of coming back and saying, I told you it was a mass hysteria event. And but otherwise, I'll be proven wrong.
Are we allowed to say we told you so if it's not?
I am.
Standing on a pile of dead bodies going, I told you so,
Told you
Scott.
it'd be bad.
It was all worth it just to prove Scott wrong.
That's all right.
Finally a win.
You are, of course, listening to Looking Forward, a product of the Institute of Public Affairs. Don't forget to join or donate if you haven't already. Go to ipa.org.au. We have come to that part of the show, our Books and Culture segment, where our wonderful panellists tell us what they've been reading or watching or listening to, in this case, over the summer. Who would like to kick us off?
I'll start with the wildly overpraised Fleishman is in Trouble by someone called Taffy Brodessa Ackner. She is a staff writer for the New York Times. It's really... so I won't explain why I read it, but it's the fashionable, it's the it book of 2019, and lots of people were praising it. So
what they call middle-brow literature.
It is middle-brow literature. It's a portrait of a marriage in New York.
I think middle-brow is an underrated brow. I'm going to talk about a middle-brow film later.
Just bear with me. So it's a portrait of marriage. It's set in New York. It's not very remarkable. I did finish it, but I was reminded of it. So I only read it like 2 weeks ago. I can't remember any of the plot whatsoever. They're getting a divorce, I think. It's really unclear. But it just really struck me how New York, this is an online discussion that's been going around over the last couple of days, New York just absolutely dominates literature. And people who are staff writers for the New York Times or the New York Magazine, or they also dominate what we view as middle-brow, highbrow literature. They live in Brooklyn. She lives in Brooklyn, turns out. So as I'm reading this discussion, I'm checking against her profile. Oh my God, that's the same thing. And it's just not interesting. And I've read a few of these sort of it novels that have been going around over the last couple of years because I'm trying to read more fiction. And it just they just don't land because they've got nothing interesting to say. Their authors have no experience that is unique. If it was the first writer from Brooklyn who set their story in New York, then maybe it would be interesting. But we know what New York is. We see it in every movie and every novel. Anyway, so that's
because they're scared of this idea of cultural appropriation now that you can't really pretend to be anything else, so you have to write.
Well, yeah, look, that there could be something to that, but I'm not that excited by someone who goes and pretends to be from a different culture. I'm very supportive of cultural appropriation, but I don't think that's the solution. The solution is to get people who've done more interesting things to write books about what they've done.
If they haven't had an interesting life,
just do more interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So everybody's been told, write about yourself, and turns out everybody lives in Brooklyn.
Right, what you know. Well, comfortable middle class existence it is.
And I'm disappointed with my life, and I'm not that, and my marriage isn't going well.
History is another field where this has just been overrun by this idea that we should focus on the minutiae of suburban life. Now, I am a suburbanite. I love the suburbs. I actually will defend them positively. But we've sort of gone from telling a story about big events and the people who drive them to let's have. And I'm thinking about. I saw over the holidays. I saw Come From Away, which is this play about planes that were diverted to Newfoundland on September 11th.
Oh, yeah. And everybody was very welcoming.
And everyone was very welcoming. It's a nice story about how nice Canadians are, which is actually true if you go to Canada. They really are very pleasant people.
Pleasant race.
But what I was struck by was there's maybe 2 mentions in the whole thing about 9/11 and no mention of all the people who died. And all I could think was the most interesting thing that happened on September 11 was that a lot of people died in a terrorist attack, not that a plane got diverted and a Canadian woman had to look after a monkey or a cat that had syphilis or something, which is actually like a subplot in the play. And I was like, can we... there's a sense in which reducing the great scope of human life to abandon animals on cages on planes that is obscene, frankly, and Marxist, of course, but...
Separate point.
It's always about Marxism. Well, is there a contrast in the film that you wanted to talk about?
Yes, and so I wanted to talk about...
As long as you're on a roll, mate.
Yeah. While I'm ranting, the cultural segment is where I shine. It's like I watched over the holidays. I watched a movie that when it came out, it was touted as like a big award season movie, but has ended up being overlooked. It was nominated in one technical category at the Oscars, and this is a movie called Ad Astra by James Gray.
Did you watch it on a plane?
No.
Because I did.
I watched it on a plane as well.
Yeah. We're all movies
I wish I'd seen it in the cinema because it's a beautiful film. And it's called Ad Astra because it's about Brad Pitt plays an astronaut whose father is a real hero of space exploration, and he gets given this mission to go. They tell him we thought, the story is that his father is this hero because he was lost on this great mission to go out to the outer reaches of the solar system in the search for life. And Brad Pitt gets told, no, your father is still out there, and the ship that he was in control of is now deteriorating rapidly and causing these problems, and we need to find him, and we need you to go and find him, basically. And so it sets up this... it's a kind of father-son dynamic. It's kind of classic American theme in particular. But what's really interesting about this movie, particularly in contrast to what I was just saying, is that not only does it focus on the people who are actually involved, but
it's just going on in the background, but it's a
that
little
it was
story about marriage.
but that was misunderstood as being only about the relationship of this father and son, where it was actually about Brad Pitt trying to emulate his father, and at the end of the film, what he learns is that his father is a failure, and that his life's work was stupid, and this is all symbolised in the movie by his father is on this epic search for life in the solar system and ignores his own family and abandons his son. That's the fundamental irony in it, and the symbol is that he's gone out to the outer reaches of the solar system, away from the sun, away from the truth, and the end of the film. Look, it's not a spoiler. But anyway, Brad Pitt has to
No, that's a big spoiler alert, mate. But anyway, that's fine.
Brad Pitt, anyway, Brad Pitt makes his way back to Earth and reconnects with his estranged wife. And the last word is he sends an audio text and he says, submit. Submit. He submits the message, but the message is submit to your life here, the real things, the things that actually matter. And this is a bizarre message to smuggle into a Hollywood movie, that essentially it's not just there's no place like home, but home is actually where the real value is, and this entire progressive scientific mission of going out into the universe to try and understand it just takes you away from things that actually matter.
That's true, but I can make a contrary argument. I'm not going to try not to spoil it too much. It's not necessarily contradictory, but it's...
I've already spoiled it.
So his father's actually going out there to find God. And the discovery is that there is no God in that sense. So come back and be with your family.
So the search for extraterrestrial intelligent
is
life
actually a search for God in the father's. Anyway, we can debate the higher level themes, but I really like this movie.
He's on the wrong track though, because he's going away from the sun.
Sure.
That's an awesome reading, Andrew, I must say.
What I really enjoyed about that film, actually, it's of a genre of science fiction of sad people in science fiction. So sad people in space, sad people in strange alien wildernesses, which I just really enjoy. This sort of adult science fiction, Annihilation, Interstellar, those sort of movies that are coming out at the moment. They're great fun. But I just really love the world building in it. There's so many ideas in that movie that you just want to spend more time with, that they move over quite quickly. And unlike so much of what you see at the cinemas, you can imagine multiple stories existing in that world.
Yeah, and it's cleverly...
Because they go to the moon and the Mars, and they've got these complex political economies and complex diplomatic...
And it steals the structure of Apocalypse Now. Which itself is based on Heart of Darkness, which is the idea that explorers go looking for something and basically get lost in the darkness.
And they get madder and madder.
And they go crazy. Yeah. And so I think that's... and it's a good frame for a story, because he goes, episode to episode, place to place.
I do have to point out that the physics is rubbish. Like, you just can't... Oh, there's a ship over there. I'll just go over and help them. When you're halfway between two planets.
Swimming in space.
Yeah. Like, you just veer over.
The third act, people do things for no reason.
Yeah.
But the first half is fantastic.
Yeah, at the symbolic level it works. Yeah. No, I agree. No, that's beautiful. I'm actually going to pass on my pick, because Bella is going to talk about a book and a person that we dearly love at the IPA, and I'd rather build on that for the final segment of this show. So
yes, this is highbrow, I suppose. So the sad passing of Sir Roger Scruton on the 12th of January this year. So this is a book that I have on my desk. It's not one that I read over summer, but it's one that I refer to a lot. It's the Uses of Pessimism. And actually everything that we've been talking about today has he explored in his various fallacies. Each chapter deals with a fallacy. So utopian fallacy, planning fallacy, zero-sum fallacy, the born-free fallacy, which is obviously underpins the modern education idea of education ruins children. They're born absolutely perfectly. So that's a book that I think is very relevant now. It was 20 years ago, but it's really set this idea of, of the section of society trying to create a world that with what he calls a unscrupulous optimism, a perfect world, whereas we know it's impossible, and we have what he calls a scrupulous optimism. We're a bit more. We look at the pros and cons. So anyway, that's the book that he wrote. What was it, 50 books, I think, in his, and one operetta
40
and 2 plays,
yeah.
and I mean, he was a Renaissance man. It was a huge loss. It's irreplaceable.
Yeah, I mean the idea of a conservative philosopher, they're vanishingly.
Who was more recognised everywhere else, but of course the land of his birth.
And the thing that makes Scruton, he what separates him from almost everyone else who's ever written about conservatism is that he was a philosopher first. So his work starts out in aesthetics, and he developed over the period of his life his own brand of a kind of idealist philosophy that's very heavily influenced by the Germans, and not so much by the analytic tradition with which he's most associated. And I think the loss for conservatism is his remarkable erudition, but also that conservatism in the last since the Second World War has been unfortunately dominated by journalists, and that's not to say that these people have all been wrong or bad, but it's very rare to have a figure like Scruton with that erudition who comes to conservatism through a philosophical outlook. And if you only read his political books, and they're obviously worth reading, but the worldview that he describes in them is rooted in a much deeper much deeper philosophical commitments.
Well, he sort of tackles metaphysics, and he's a metaphysician as well, really, because he talks about God, but not in a directly.
Well, and so the only criticism that I would level at Scruton, and this is the thing that in the academic responses to his political work that tends to come through, is that there's an ambiguity about whether Scruton thinks that a conservative worldview ultimately comes down to a metaphysical commitment, say to belief in God of some description, or like a Platonic idea but some kind of metaphysical idea, or whether these are just constructs. Right?
Well, I think his metaphysical idea was that beauty, if you pursue beauty, you find God.
Yeah, and do you mind explaining that just a bit more deeply? Not deeply.
Actually, let me have a stab at it, because you can tell me whether I'm on the wrong tram. But this is the alternative conservative tradition, if you like, is more sentimentalist. It's more about conservatism's a disposition. It's about how we feel about each other and the little platoons of which we are a part. I recognise you as a fellow human through our moral sentiments. Whereas Scruton was actually much more in a continental tradition where there was something bigger at play.
There's also another one that I think he's
Tell me if
reacting
I'm wrong,
against. There's also another one that I think he reacts against, which is sort of what I'm going to call as conservative rationalism, which is that there's a prudential claim for conservative policy that we don't, a sort of Hayekian conservative model where we don't know why we have the institutions we have, so therefore we should only prudentially change them, or and we should maintain them if we've, certainly if we haven't got any better ideas.
And so the fault line in conservatism as political philosophy is exactly that there's a kind of empiricist conservatism, and that's where it intermingles with classical liberalism, in that you have this, as you say, a prudential, pragmatic concern for managing change with certain sort of a certain kind of analysis of change that usually starts from the status quo, and that's where you see a kind of overlap between someone like Michael Oakeshott and someone like some much more radical like James Buchanan, right, who talks a lot about the status quo as well. Chris, you put me onto that. But on the other hand, there's a branch of conservatism, and the argument is from that branch is that theirs is the true conservatism because it's the only thing that can actually give you a reason. So the empirical one kind of leads to progress but slower, right? Whereas a true conservative alternative to progressivism, so the argument
standing
goes,
athwart history yelling slow.
Yeah. Whereas the alternative would actually be to have some reason to recognise and preserve things that are unchanging or true in a metaphysical sense. And the argument that some people have made about Scruton is that it's not clear, perhaps because he straddles to the continental and analytic traditions, it's not clear whether he thinks that there really are fixed points in the universe, in the metaphysical universe, or whether he just thinks that these are constructs within an idealist frame. And I think the point about beauty is that, and I think this is where Scruton ended up in his life after he became religious, was that if you look at the world closely enough, you will see things that really are true. And I think that's the connection. But Scruton's work is extremely rich and I think underappreciated for its richness.
Yeah, it will take years to unpack, and his political stuff was great too. His book on the postmodern writers, which he was able to read mostly in the original French, republished as Fools, Frauds and Firebrands, which I coincidentally reviewed for the IPA's magazine. It's terrific at unpacking postmodernism, but by someone who actually understands the philosophical traditions on which it was growing. And he could make a distinction between someone like Foucault, who did occasionally have some things to say that were useful and true within their tradition, as opposed to what he called the Parisian nonsense machine. Once you get into Derrida and Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari and all these guys who were not just breaking up paradigms, but were just talking gibberish, essentially. He could actually make those distinctions with some authority. So
which is something that we should all try to do.
Yeah, as opposed to saying postmodernism is rubbish.
As someone who will defend Foucault, not obviously 100%, but Foucault does add value.
Occasionally. So, no, thank you, Bella and Andrew, for reflecting on the great Sir Roger Scruton, who was a guest of the IPA, Chris.
Oh, that's a great question. That I should have prepared.
2014.
2014.
I travelled around a lot with him, and it was a real pleasure.
I can only report that I had a beer with him, but that was
that's
enough.
a pretty good anecdote by itself. Though,
had a beer with.
I took a lot of taxis
after that
with him.
function. No, very good. So you have been listening to Looking Forward, the first show back. This is a podcast of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you want to support our research, this podcast, or indeed our other great digital products, please go to ipa.org.au, join or donate. I'd like to thank our panellists today, Dr. Chris Berg,
Thanks, Scott.
Dr. Bella de Brera, and Andrew Bushnell.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.